And there we go. How are we today, everyone? I'm back for the third section of the Album a Day project. The dates in this video will range from January 29th, the first day of EDM week, to the 11th of February, yesterday, which was the last day of the spin-offs week. So let's cut the intros and get right into it. And to start this week off, we had Worlds by Porter Robinson. This is a synth-driven electro house album. It was under synthwave and electro house genre-wise from the brief research I'd done. But I know EDM, metal, and jazz, especially, genres are very fluid, and the terms kind of don't mean all too much. It's more about the sound that's being output. That having been said, though, this is definitely up there in terms of the greats of this style of EDM. Every moment from this album felt calculated, it felt engineered to be the best version of itself. And from the way that Porter was introduced to me, he very much came across as a perfectionist to the people who had introduced his music to me, not just um, in passing, but also from anything I've read on his music from the past. So that combined with the just very varied, not to say sources of sound, but the varied palette of synths, of percussion throughout this album made it all flow very smoothly, excuse me, from one cover to the other. Tracks like Hear the Bells and Years of War felt like they were made for arenas, and on the flip side, you had tracks like Sad Machine, Fresh Static Snow, and Flicker, which felt more on the emotional through line side of the EDM rather than the momentous up tempo like banger style, like in tracks like Hear the Bells. Lionhearted was another standout to me. It was really cute, felt like a better version of what was on the radio at the time. The early 2010s had a lot of hollow sounding radio EDM, and Lionhearted felt like it just did much of what those songs had attempted to do rather, a lot better. The closer as well, such an interesting blend of down tempo minimalism and the pulsing momentum carrying over from the rest of the album. Would definitely recommend overall. Easy 10 out of 10 in my books. And I feel like that's kind of a given just from what I've heard from people on this album. It seems to have been very well received in general. So easy 10 out of 10 on this one. For day two, January 30th, we had Homogenic by Bjork. This one was much more eclectic than what I had expected from just what I had heard from EDM. I know a lot of the genre delved into more experimentation in terms of the actual sound palette itself. But this album messed with a lot more than that. The percussion all felt either robotic or ethereal. A lot of the synth lines and vocal deliveries felt almost as if they were clashing with the rhythm from the bass line and the percussion. But overall, I can definitely see why Bjork was remembered so fondly with albums like this. Unravel, All Neon Like, and Alarm Call were my top three. Personally, some of the best songs I've gotten out of the genre as well. They've gotten pretty much nonstop repeat on my playlist, and my friends have gotten kind of annoyed of hearing them. So I apologize to anyone who has driven with me in the past 2 weeks, but your speakers have definitely felt the wrath of the sub bass on this album. 9.5 out of 10 overall. Definitely something I would recommend, just not on the same level of polish or quality as Worlds. Next up is an album I was actually introduced to through a Childish Gambino feature, Merryweather Post Pavilion by Animal Collective. My Girls, of course, is the song I'm referring to since it was sampled on a track of the same name by Childish Gambino, and it is a triumphant declaration of love blended with a rejection of materialism, would be the best way I describe it. This album is absolutely fantastic cover to cover. The aforementioned My Girls, In the Flowers being an amazing opener. Bluish was very heavenly. Taste was an amazing. With the chorus of Am I Really All the Things That Are Outside of Me still echoing in my mind on the day to day. and then Lion in a Coma, what a fucking groovy track. It hit me out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting the hectic tempo switching of the vocals on that track at that moment in the album, at least. Another easy 10. This week is shaping up to be one of the better ones as well. I know we just came off a week with a few 10s, but this week is up there as well. Moving on. Next, we had Selected Ambient Works by Aphex Twin. Specifically, the first volume, since I know there was a Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. This album was really enjoyable to me, but it felt lacking in terms of anything engaging. Of course, that being the point of ambient music. It'll definitely need a re-listen from me to get more in terms of substantial criticism, but on a first listen, it just hadn't hit me to the extent that I was expecting, given the legacy that this album has built up. Obviously, the album cover is all over meme pages on Instagram, through the music sphere. Everyone and their mother has talked about it at some point. It just hadn't hit me to the same extent that I was expecting an album with such a legacy to. But not to say it was a bad album in any regard. I would still at least consider it great at the very minimum, with an 8 out of 10. But as mentioned, it will definitely need a re-listen down the line to see if it ages better with time. Much of the value of albums in this style of ambient tends to be their ability to just set a tone and stick with it. So obviously that will be something that is left to be decided. This album's score of an 8 out of 10 is not concrete, nor are any of these, to be fair. They're largely my first impressions. But on this one especially, take my rating with a bit of caution. 8 out of 10 overall, though, will definitely need a couple of re-listens. I don't have the track list pulled up, but off the top of my head, I remember specifically liking the second and sixth tracks on this one. So check those out if you wanted to get a sampling of what's in store on this record. All right. Following that really interesting album, to say the very least, in spite of how I had responded to it. We had Skin by Flume, an artist I had already been familiar with through the Hi, This Is Flume mixtape, and Never Be Like You from this album, having been a radio hit at the time. This is more of what I had loved from the artist that I had grown to become slightly familiar with. I had actually seen them live at Osheaga in 2019 as well. So much of this listening to this album had been rekindling memories from the experience I had when I had seen them live. So to get into the substance of this album, the stop-start pulse and the scattered flaring of chaotic clattering on a few different tracks added a lot of texture to what is already a very solid production foundation. Obviously, if it weren't for the little triplet synth flares in the backgrounds of the booms and kicks in the percussion, the track, Never Be Like You, that I had mentioned, would have still been a radio hit, but it wouldn't have aged as well as it had, in my opinion. Numb and Getting Colder, Wallfuck, Smoke and Retribution, You Know, and Innocence were my top 5 on this record. Specific standouts to Smoke and Retribution for the amazing Vince Staples feature, and Numb and Getting Colder for the beautiful vocals from the guest feature. I unfortunately don't know how to pronounce their name because it is Eastern European, and that is the region I'm least familiar with linguistically. But yeah, all that to say, Flume is an artist that I'm very much looking forward to. They have an album just on the horizon as I'm recording this, and that is something I'm looking forward to as well. Skin, overall, 8.5 out of 10. Would recommend to anyone who likes a bit more weird to their EDM. Following from that wonderful record, we have Cross by Justice. Now, this is my fucking jam. The various vocalists that they had throughout the entire project, different tempos, and various grooves throughout this entire record, added a lot of replay value while still keeping me dancing cover to cover. Obviously, everyone's heard DANCE. And then DVNO was a track I had heard a couple of times from parties with friends, but going into this, I had practically no knowledge or no expectations for what I was going into, and I hadn't stopped moving from the minute I pressed play to the minute I hit stop at the end of it. Genuinely one of the best records if you just want to get up and burn some calories, having a good time. Uh, 9.5 out of 10 overall. DVNO was my favorite track on the record, without a doubt. I don't know what it is about the absolute vacuum of cool that the lyrics have, but the delivery combined with the subject of the lyrics themselves just adds a lot of like tongue-in-cheek coyness and makes it not just a great dance track, but have that little bit of like a chuckle to it throughout to me. Overall, 9.5 out of 10. Amazing record. Weird to think that that's tied for third this week with a 9.5, but overall, definitely definitely give this one a listen. If there's anything from this week to take away, strongest recommendation would be Merryweather Post Pavilion, but this is a close second. It's earned a legacy for a good reason. I'll say that much. Next up, we have Until Now by Swedish House Mafia. A lot of this projects are songs that I'd already been familiar with due to the ubiquity of Swedish House Mafia on early 2010s pop radio, with the obvious Don't You Worry Child having been everywhere. Um, but having the chance to hear them on good speakers definitely changed the way that I felt about a lot of these tracks. Quite good overall. Nothing exemplary though, just another track that sits on that great but not excellent line. Favorite tracks from this one being Miami to Ibiza, which I believe had Tiny Tempa as a featured vocalist. I recognize the voice from somewhere, but I don't know if it's from that or from something else. The Every Teardrop remix on this album, which highlighted Chris Martin's vocals, and kind of added a new direction to them. And Calling as well was another excellent track on this album, and probably my favorite overall. 8 out of 10, nothing exemplary, like I had said, but still very good cover to cover. Would definitely recommend this one if you have any sort of nostalgia for early 2010s radio EDM, or just pop radio in general from that era, which I know a lot of people around my age probably do. That being said, that is the last album for EDM week, and we are on to the spin offs and side projects. Up next, to start off the spin offs and side projects week, we have Praying Mantis' Forever in Time. My good friend Britt had recommended this album to me, given that I had mentioned that I had liked a bit of Iron Maiden's work in the past, and this band essentially being a supergroup and a love letter to Iron Maiden in the same breath. Um, really good overall, albeit not exactly the style of metal rather I tend to go for. I'm more on the prog jazzy side than the more I guess rock and the harder variants of it that come from there. But this album was still excellent in its own right. Wasted Years was a great opener. Messiah gave some really Sonic Adventure vibes with the guitar lines. Best Years was absolutely incredible. Blood of an Angel had some great solos. Valley of the Kings was a bit of a drag, but not bad by any means of its own. Changes was a good return into form after the slight slump in the record. Man Behind the Mask, absolute favorite from this track so far. I've done a couple of trips out jogging as of late since the weather has gotten a lot better, and that song has played every single time I've been out. And if it hasn't, by the time I'm starting to head home, I throw it in queue so I can pick up the tempo a little bit. Just gets my heart going every time, and it definitely serves a good spot on my workout playlist. Remember My Name is a great example of what my friends and I have jokingly grown to refer to as ballad metal. An interesting fusion of sounds that doesn't always work, but in this specific case, it had. The Day the Sun Turned Cold had a groovy ass bass line too, and really good drum work. And then the title track of the closer was kind of forgettable, unfortunately. Really good project overall, though. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Again, great, but not astounding as far as the genre goes. If I was more familiar with Maiden's albums, and of course their members individually, I assume this would grow a bit more on me. But given the knowledge I have right now, I would be confident calling it an 8 out of 10. Next up, We have a blast of a time from one of my favorite songwriters, Paul McCartney, of course, everyone's fucking favorite. This album was nearly immaculate cover to cover. The opener, Band on the Run alone, had 4 or 5 different moments where I realized, oh, this is from this song? Really? The opening guitar riff, for example, I've heard all over TV. The second section between the actual, what I'll call the Band on the Run part of the song, and the more smooth opening is something I had heard sampled on TV all the time. And then, of course, the infamous plucking that goes into the second and third repetition of the Band on the Run chorus itself. The nice little guitar riff that gets thrown in there is iconic in its own right. Every track between the opener and Mamunia were extremely enjoyable. Bluebird being very good. And then Picasso's into 1985 was also a perfect closing, but No Words was a track that I felt kind of lacked the same punch as the rest of the album. Not to say it isn't a great track in its own right, but when the rest of the album felt perfect or near it, having a track with even a perceivable flaw of just not being as enjoyable as the rest of the project brought it down a little bit, unfortunately. That being said, this album is still a 9.5 out of 10. Genuinely a masterpiece as far as albums go, and probably my third favorite Paul associated album after Rubber Soul and Magical Mystery Tour, which I feel like those will be contentious in their own rights, but we can worry about that down the road. Next up, taking a leap forward about 45 years, we have Wisdom of Elders by Shabaka and the Ancestors. Shabaka Hutchings, known for his other projects like The Comet is Coming, and the album Your Queen is a Reptile, and the group associated with that, Sons of Kemet. This album is just more of what I've grown to love from Shabaka. A lot of from the roots jazz, with a very modern, more proggy production focus. Much more focus on the rhythm itself rather than the structure surrounding it. Mzwandile, I hope I didn't butcher that. The opening track felt a lot like Shabaka's take on Fela Kuti, with the following track, Joyous, being incredibly dancey and an incredibly good use of 5/4. The following 2 tracks, The Observer and The Sea, were absolutely amazing, with The Observed falling just below that bar, and Natty being top 5 songs I've come across with this project thus far. I would stretch to say top 3 as well, although I will need to do a more cohesive re-listen towards the 1/3 point in the year. I'll probably do breakdowns every 4 months of the best songs thus far, best albums thus far, and so on. That being said, the ending stretch of OBS through Nguni, I probably butchered that as well. Absolutely beautiful way to close the album out. Powerful cover to cover, hardly a moment wasted. Just gorgeous. I don't want to sound redundant, but gorgeous, groovy, and absolutely powerful as far as modern jazz goes. This feels like the intersection between Fela Kuti and Kamasi Washington. I hope that makes sense to anyone who's familiar with either of those 2 artists. But as far as production philosophy, rhythmic choices, the general instrumentation, it feels like somewhere between those two and almost the exact middle, if anything. 9.5 out of 10. Can't recommend enough. Great place to start if you want to get deeper into jazz. Not the best point of entry if you're unfamiliar with the genre, though. I'll be getting to that when I get around to jazz as a genre. Following an amazing modern jazz record, we have a jazz-inspired old-school hip-hop album, Vaudeville Villain by Victor Vaughn, one of many Doom aliases. This is a top 3 Doom record, in my opinion, without a doubt. The only albums falling above it being Madvillainy and Food, in my opinion. I haven't listened to a couple of the records that are more well received within the fan base, like Mouse with the Mask. It's been a while since I've given it a proper listen. And don't know if it's Born Like This or Born This Way, but that album I haven't listened to yet either. Back to this one, though. Every feature on this album was incredible. Some of Doom's best storytelling in terms of his discography that I've been exposed to. Flows are immaculate, and as always, he blends effortlessly into the character of Victor Vaughn. The track with the rapper is credited, but they're in the track as Nikki as a character. It's escaping me at the moment, unfortunately. But that song is absolutely incredible. Both of the open mic nights were a blast, and the various friend features of Dooms throughout the project were all equally great, with some credited under their King Ghidra aliases, some credited under the Victor Vaughn universe characters, and others credited just as their actual rap names. But of course, what can you say about a Doom album other than it is motherfucking MF Doom? You can't go wrong. Genuinely, I don't think there's a bad album in his discog, and I've listened to Keys to the Cuffs. So, me saying that and still giving this high of praise to this record is not something that can be understated. 10 out of 10 front to back. Again, top 3 within his discog in my opinion, but that is something that might change with more exposure to the rest of his backlog. Taking a complete change of pace from a more upbeat and definitely more extroverted album to something that is far more introspective and challenging to say as far as listenings go, is AM OK by Atoms for Peace. I'd done a bit of research into this album since I like Thom Yorke a lot. I like Flea, and I've listened to a bit of Beck and enjoyed what I've heard. So the different parts of this album and the band behind it, Atoms for Peace, are definitely something that had interested me. But the quote that had most specifically captured my attention was a Thom Yorke quote. I want the listener to be unable to tell when the human starts and when the machine ends. A very enticing concept for an album, in my opinion. It feels like the exact intersection of an AI's take on Thom Yorke and people like Flea, as I mentioned before, teaming up with the man himself to paint the uncanny valley of music as vividly as they're able to. Tracks like Dropped, Stuck Together Pieces, and Drug Jury and Executioner were absolutely incredible. Those 3 in specific being my top 3 on the album. Not to discount any of the other tracks on the album, though. This is up there as far as Thom Yorke affiliated albums go. I don't have a definitive ranking, but this is better than some of the Radiohead albums I've heard, definitely. I would prefer it over OK Computer, which I know would probably get my head put on a pike, since that album just hadn't called to me too much. And it's probably on the same level as Kid A, but not quite up there with In Rainbows and A Moonshaped Pool. Kid A being my 4th favorite, tied with King of Limbs, which this album obviously is acoustically similar to enough. But all that to say, definitely a top tier Thom Yorke project, 9 out of 10 overall. Would definitely recommend if you have listened to any of the artists featured in this project and want to get a different perspective on their body of work. 9 out of 10 overall. Next up, we have a complete change of pace from the previous album. A very groovy, kind of funky pop album from Lime Cordiale and Idris Elba called Cordy Elba. This album was incredibly pleasant, not something I'd really expected from an Idris Elba project, given my previous familiarity with his work was New Breed by James BKS with Q-Tip and Lil Sims, which demonstrated a lot of his rapping chops, but he has surprisingly good vocal delivery on more poppy tracks as well. His deeper vocals definitely fit the more groove-oriented production on this record quite well, with the Lime Cordiale half of things holding their half of the bargain in more than enough capacity, or competence, rather. Overall, the opener, Apple Crumble, and the 3rd track on the album, which name is escaping me right now. I hate how bad my memory's been lately. Forgive me. What's not to like also standing out with in terms of quality tracks. 8 out of 10 overall. Another one of the great but nothing excellent albums that I've stumbled into. But definitely nothing to complain about. Uh, this album I'm kind of conflicted on if more tracks would have done it better or if it would have taken away from the magic of it, since I feel like the project itself is still a little on the short side, but if you were to add any more than, let's say, 2 tracks, it would start feeling bloated. So rather than risk ruining the magic of what they have captured here, I think it would be safer to just put the project out as is, which obviously is what they ended up doing, and I think it's a great benefit at the end of the day. Concluding the second week I'm covering here and the end of the spin-off section for the Album a Day project, we have Yes Lawd by No Worries, a combination of Anderson .Paak's beautiful vocals and Knowledge's incredible production. Paak, I've not listened to any of his albums yet outside of this one, if it counts, but I've heard nothing but good things about his music, and everything I've heard from him has been incredible. The fact that he managed to upstage A Tribe Called Quest on their own song, Moving Backwards, just left me jaw dropped and made me want to check out more of his music. And around the time of that, I'd stumbled into Scared Money and Get Bigger from this project. Not having delved too much deeper, since I was happy with what I found and worried that his vocals would grow stale on me, since I wasn't the biggest fan of neo soul or pop vocals in general at the time. But this album definitely warmed me up to his music a lot, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see either Malibu or one of his later albums on the list as well further down. Tracks like Cutlass, HAN, Link Up, and Best One deserve equal levels of praise to Scared Money and Get Bigger, which were the obvious 2 takeaways from this album. Smooth front to back, with tracks like Cutlass emphasizing the more laid back, more sensual side of the albums, while tracks like Scared Money were much more triumphant, self-congratulatory, and very like self-inflating in terms of vibe. They do a very good job at turning around a bad day, and I find myself smiling anytime a song from this album comes on, regardless of which it may be. So, with that being said, let's wrap up this week with the scores. So, for these 2 weeks, we have these scores displayed here. A very high concentration of quality as far as albums go, with the weakest album here being 2 8s, Cordy Elba and Forever in Time. But neither of those albums I had any gripes with, so they're probably on the higher spectrum in terms of the albums I would give an 8 out of 10 rating. You will probably notice I grade quite high in general. None of my comments have really pointed it out yet, but I did have a couple of friends who I've shown the videos to ask for a bit more context on my grading system. So I will go ahead and do so in this kind of ending section. I guess credits roll, whatever. This is probably just the section that people forget they're listening to the video anyway. But to kind of explain, when I listen to an album, if I have nothing negative and nothing positive to say about it, and it didn't leave a bad taste in my mouth, that is what I would define as an average or a 6 out of 10. If I am mixed on it, I have some criticism, some positive things to say, that is more likely to be a 5. 4 being albums that negatively impacted me, but not to the point of like bothering. It didn't feel like an attack on my person for having been forced to listen to it or anything like that. That's like a 4 or a 3. 2 out of 10 is this album was painful to sit to. 1 out of 10 is I would not wish this album my worst enemy, and if I ever have to give a 0 to an album, that will be an album that is an affront to music as an art form, not just a complete waste of time in its own right. Towards the positive end, 7 is what I would describe as good, with minimal innovation or minimal challenge to it. An 8 out of 10 is an album that I sat there, thought about, and couldn't really come up with a word to describe other than great. 8.5 is where the excellents start trickling in. Nines and above are reserved for albums that had either impacted my taste in a direction I wasn't expecting or meaningfully impacted the music around it at the time. And then 10 out of 10s are reserved for just the absolute pinnacle of music. Of course, given the fact that I am carefully cataloging, or sorry, carefully selecting these albums among a field of thousands upon millions of albums. Of course, these will trend towards the positive. It is rare we'll see an album below a 7 out of 10. And if there is an album that falls below that point, that is the closest thing to a do not recommend I can give, other than explicitly stating otherwise that it wasn't my speed but still holds merit, which, of course, albums like 4 by Blues Traveler, I had definitely given those considerations. And same with the Death Dynamic Shroud album, I had given a 4. Those were the not my thing, but still has merit to rating. Enough rambling, I guess, though. Hope you enjoyed this video, and hope you enjoy any of the music you do check out. If you end up checking up any of these albums or any songs from them, let me know either what you thought of them, songs you wish I had spoken more on, or songs and albums you would recommend as a result of my ratings for these albums here. That being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for watching the video.